just to address that EV tax, we've put an extra speaker in today, but he's no ordinary speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, to address the EV tax, please welcome the CEO from the EV Council, Behad Jafari.
Thanks for that, John. Oh, can you hear me now? Thanks for that, John. I'm no ordinary anything, so looking forward to getting into this issue with you. Look, I appreciate that most of our guests today probably have already been following the electric vehicle tax, but just to bring everyone up to speed, over the past couple of weeks, we've had particularly South Australia and Victoria announce in their budgets their intention to introduce an exclusive and early, what we'll say a premature tax on electric vehicles. In New South Wales, the Treasurer has indicated that over the next 12 months, he'll look to bring some type of new reform to the cabinet there as well. So what that particularly means, we'll get into in a moment. But what we have a bit more detail on is South Australia and Victoria, so that's where we'll focus. In terms of detail, South Australia has sort of just made their thought bubble announcement today to say there's a tax coming, we'll introduce something next year. So far, we have seen really positive opposition to that from the opposition and the Greens and the crossbenchers. However, in Victoria, we have a bit more detail to dive into. So we have seen that their intention is to provide an annual recording where electric vehicle drivers will have to report how many kilometres they drive as of 1st of July. And the charge will be levied at 2.5 cents per kilometre for electric vehicles and 2 cents per kilometre for plug-in hybrid vehicles. So let's get into what this means for us as a sector and the uptake of electric vehicles. This, of course, we've been sort of pretty disparaging about this tax, as Professor Flannery said, of something that is far too early at this time. No one's opposed to high-minded road funding reform. That's something that the transport sector has been encouraging governments to engage in and to engage stakeholders about for the past decade now. But it's very important to note that that is not what's happening right now. It is just a tax on electric vehicles that is being proposed, not a larger road funding reform. And it comes at a time when the rest of the world is providing very generous incentives for the uptake of electric vehicles. Among a whole range of other incentives, it usually includes a financial incentive to the range of, in Australian dollars, $10,000 to $15,000 in countries like the UK, US, across Europe, across Asia, of course, countries like Norway that do quite a lot more as well. And so this now makes Australia the very first market in the world to not only not incentivize electric vehicles, but actually introduce a new tax on electric vehicles to discourage uptake. Really important to note there, you'll hear a few governments as they're defending themselves say, well, other markets around the world, like California, do have a road user charge or are beginning to implement a road user charge into electric vehicles. Really important to note that in all of those markets, there has been close to a decade's worth of 10 to 15, in California's case, $15,000 to $20,000 worth of incentives in place for electric vehicle purchases, and those incentives will continue. They are engaging in an effort to learn how a road pricing system will work. They are engaging in a reform effort, not in a tax grab on electric vehicles. But really importantly for us, what this is going to mean, unless something else is done, unless we hear something or we can work towards a more favourable outcome, it will mean that for Australia, particularly in these next few years, the investment in things like cheaper electric vehicles that Professor Flannery just spoke about, the increased availability of models will start to fall. We've already, for the past few years, had companies like Kia, Toyota, a range of others say that because other countries have supportive policies and Australia does not have supportive policies, so one is positive and one is neutral, we cannot bring our cheaper electric vehicles to your market. You can only imagine what now happens when other countries are positive and we're in fact a negative when it comes to electric vehicle uptake. That, of course, also has an impact on other things like people providing shared services for electric vehicles, as we see around the world, people investing in things like charging infrastructure. The entire ecosystem around e-mobility becomes restricted. It won't stop entirely, but looking at the projections of where we were going, that will now slow down as a result of these taxes unless something further is done. Talking about those projections, it's now increasingly clear that for the governments who have made these announcements, they have not yet, or at least not sharing, but it looks like they have failed to model what impacts these taxes will have on electric vehicle uptake and their plans to reduce emissions. Should be very clear here, a state government saying And both South Australia and Victoria have said, because we're investing tens of millions of dollars somewhere else in buses and charging infrastructure, that offsets what we're doing in taxing electric vehicle uptake. Look, this doesn't take an economist to tell you no one walks into a car dealership with the state government's balance sheet in their back pocket saying it doesn't matter that I have to spend more on this car because the state government's doing something somewhere else. That's not how consumer purchasing works. So it will restrict uptake. If they had engaged in that effort, or if they had bothered to consult with the industry or the larger sector about that effort, they would have found what we're seeing now, which is independent academic research that if you haven't seen, Google Dr. Jake Whitehead. He has provided the numbers that show that uptake will fall of between now and 2050 anywhere from 35 to 68%. That's a matter of millions fewer electric vehicles on our roads come 2050. What does that matter for? We spoke about transport making up 20% of emissions in Victoria. Under business as usual, so even before this tax was announced, that was due to rise over the next 10 years, not decline. Now we have a tax on electric vehicles, the answer to helping that decline. It's very clear now, and Dr. Whitehead's research has found this, that as things stand right now, particularly now with this tax in place, and if nothing else is introduced to offset that, Victoria cannot reach its net zero emissions targets. Those targets are now an impossibility. They are net zero emissions, so you can offset them elsewhere, but it's important to remember there are going to be some sectors like agriculture and others that are going to struggle, if not ever be able to entirely decarbonize. So those offsets will need to go to those sectors. There is no country around the world that is looking at an area like road transport and saying we can just not decarbonize that. In fact, in order to achieve net zero by 2050, you would require for Victoria and for Australia as a whole to go from 0.6% of new vehicle sales being electric today to 100%, ideally by 2030, if not at the latest by 2035, in order to reach that number come 2050. So that obviously something that's not being achieved. And if that confuses you, that's because cars stay on the road for about 15, 17 odd years on average. A little bit of explanation about why is this happening. It clearly sounds very strange that these very sort of progressive governments who are doing great work in clean energy are now taxing electric vehicles. From our insights, what we can see is that state treasurers around the country for the past 12 odd months engaged in what is a noble and high-minded idea of reform around road funding. The idea started off in principle as a medium to long-term goal to change the way that we fund our roads. Somewhere along the way, and particularly as a result of some lobbying by other sectors, those principles were forgotten, and this was bastardized into a quick tax on electric vehicles rather than the much harder and much more elaborate work of road funding reform that would see all vehicles captured, for instance, really importantly, other taxes replaced with a usage type charge, congestion charges, emissions charges. Again, none of these are new principles. Transport experts have been recommending these for well over a decade now. It's hard work to do, and here governments have clearly chosen to squib the hard work and go for what they think is an easy route. Now, I want to make very clear to people that this all sounds terrible, but what you shouldn't take away from this is that it's terrible and things are awful. What you should take from this is that what these governments are looking at is saying the easiest thing we can possibly do right now is just tax electric vehicles and get away with it. So our task becomes making that not an easy thing for them to do. There are a range of websites out there from the Australia Institute, GetUp, and of course ours at stopthecleanairtax.org.au. Encourage you guys to visit those, use them to send emails to your representatives, be active about these things online through social media, ensure that all of the efforts that we're taking through speaking with governments and the rest is backed up by a lot of public pressure. Be speaking to your friends about this, people who are supportive of climate carbon reductions and electric vehicles, making sure that voices are being heard, so that the idea that you can get away with taxing electric vehicles quickly and early is removed, and that we can get back to the serious discussion of actual road reform. Thank you.